Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Al-Azzawi. Prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, many international allies of President George Bush warned him against the course he was set to embark upon. Arab leaders warned that an invasion of Iraq would, in their words, open the gates of hell. Certain European allies were uneasy about the rather dubious claims used to justify their military venture. Saddam Hussein is now gone. But what are the regional and international repercussions of the ongoing instability in Iraq? In this episode, we look at the lessons we should learn from the 2003 military intervention in Iraq and what are the options with regard to Iraq's political future.
It's often said history never repeats itself. The Vietnam War in the 1960s, which dragged on for 14 years, is an almost direct parallel to the invasion of Iraq. Historians say, similar to Vietnam, the decision to go to war in Iraq was to spread and uphold democracy. But the route to Baghdad was far more complicated. The war split the Western superpowers and the United Nations. US President George Bush and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair were convinced the United Nations' blessings were not necessary to invade Iraq, prompting the then Secretary General Kofi Annan to label it an illegal war. Critics charge that the war's biggest lesson was the deception of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction.
We know from sources that a missile brigade outside Baghdad was dispersing rocket launchers and warheads containing biological warfare agent.
Although supporters now claim Washington was misled by a failure in military intelligence, many felt the US should openly admit its mistake.
The bottom line is, I think it's time the world and the American people realize that we have been lied to by the Bush administration.
In military terms, the Iraq War is supposed to be a showcase of American sophisticated high-technology weaponry. Instead, it shattered the myth of US military might and credibility. After 5 years and more than $600 billion spent, the Iraq War became one of America's worst military misadventures. The horrific sectarian killings shocked the world and undermined the Bush administration's naive notion of turning a totalitarian regime into a liberal, democratic society overnight. As the lessons of the Iraq War are being examined and documented, experts now wonder how long it will take to contain all of the dispersed ills.
To shed some light on the lessons of the war on Iraq, I'm delighted to welcome Lord David Owen, former British Foreign Secretary who later in his career took on a key diplomatic role in resolving the conflict in former Yugoslavia. Lord Owen has said that serious mistakes over the military intervention in Iraq could have been avoided and that the aftermath of the war has been among the worst he has ever seen. Lord David Owen, looking at Iraq 5 years after the invasion, did you ever imagine that it could go so wrong?
No, I supported it because I thought that we needed to deal with Saddam Hussein, and I believed that there was never going to be a stable region while he was there. But I had no idea that we would see such crass incompetence in the handling of the aftermath of the taking of Baghdad by President Bush and by the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. It is quite extraordinary that these men made no serious planning for the really quite obvious problems that were going to confront them once Saddam Hussein was no longer in power and they were in control militarily of Baghdad.
Is that one way of looking at it, or is that a reflection on the limitations of power, regardless how many troops, how many boots you put on the ground? If the ground is not ready for change, it could have gone wrong as it did.
It could have, and you may be right, and some of those people who are always against going into Iraq may claim that they have been vindicated. I was not in favor of taking Saddam Hussein out in 1991. I think the nature of the coalition that was assembled by George Bush's father was such that it would have been very unwise for us to have really angered, and quite justifiably angered, those Arab partners that we had, like Saudi Arabia, we had Syria, we had, of course, Egypt, many countries in that coalition by going to Baghdad. That went beyond the remit of the UN. But in the case of 2002 and 3, when we were considering going into Iraq, the British and American diplomats and military all knew the difficulties of toppling Saddam Hussein, not to take their advice, not to take very carefully the need for a substantial number of troops. I mean, the chief of the American army warned that we would need 200,000 troops at a minimum. He virtually lost his job. Now, he was right. And there is no doubt that we did not put anywhere near enough troops to control not the military situation, but the political and civil insurrection that was bound to happen in Baghdad and in major cities in Iraq once the actual invasion had been successful.
On a military ground, many people objected to it, like General Shinseki you mentioned. Other partners of the coalition, until that moment, the French and the Germans, they objected to it on a moral and a legal ground. When the US and Britain failed to get a second resolution from the United Nations, the French pretty much they bought and they threatened the veto.
Don't give me, no, come on, come on, let's be objective. Don't give me morality on the side of the French or the Germans. They were breaking sanctions against Saddam Hussein. They were relying on the British and the Americans to continue the no-fly zone. I mean, everybody says, oh, Saddam was contained. He was barely being contained. The no-fly zone was coming under increasing pressure, and it was greater risk to our pilots in maintaining it. And without the no-fly zone, who has any doubt that Saddam Hussein would have gone back once again into the Kurdish part of Iraq, and that he would have repressed any opposition, and particularly that from the majority Shia population. There's a very convenient forgetting of the evil and of the horrors that were associated with Saddam Hussein's regime. And the only people who were prepared from 1991 onwards to consistently constrain him were British and American governments. That's the reality. The French and the Germans had backed off it entirely. So don't give me morality. They may have decided for their own political reasons they weren't going to support this, but it was not a moral choice.
Nobody argues with you regarding the brutality of the regime in Baghdad, but since we are talking about the international law, how do you assess in that case what Kofi Annan said, that this is an illegal war?
Well, I don't agree with him, and I respect Kofi Annan, and his judgment may be better than mine. We certainly would have been much better to have had the authority of the United Nations behind us for that specific action that we were taking. But we had the authority of the United Nations to go into Iraq in 1991. We had the authority of the United Nations to effectively stop the genocide of the Kurds when, even after the ceasefire, when the UN ceasefire was in place, Saddam Hussein, within weeks, was breaking it. Now, we then maintained a no-fly zone without the United Nations condemning us. Now, we can argue about how much they supported us, but the use of force, the fact that Saddam Hussein was a threat to the peace, was endorsed by many UN resolutions and no contrary resolutions. Now, I say, you're stretching it a little, but I do not believe to this day that the British and American action was illegal. We were going pretty close to stretching the meaning of the Charter, but I think we were within the Charter limits, and we were acting, in my view, under the authority of the United Nations in maintaining our position, which was that Saddam Hussein was not able to be constrained without the use of force, and we used that force through the no-fly zone. The no-fly zone was becoming increasingly difficult to operate, and it's sheer humbug for people to claim otherwise.
If it is not illegal, if it is not immoral, was it the right one? With the benefit of hindsight and knowing exactly what happened after 5 years, and many people, they play the game, I told you so. Would you recommend the same thing today as you did to Tony Blair 5 years ago?
Well, Tony Blair recommended it to me. If Tony Blair had been straight with me about the intelligence and what basis on which he was going in, I doubt I would have supported it even at the time. I mean, a lot of the problems was that many of us genuinely thought that there were nuclear weapons and that he was pursuing, as he had done before, a biological and chemical weapons program, and a lot of that information was incorrect. Now, we can all be Professor Hindsight. In a way, you can't pose that question. What you have to do is deal with the situation as you thought it at the time. And remember, one of the things you have to do when you're no longer in government is you have to trust the government of the day. An awful lot of us trusted the British government, and as a consequence of the lack of trust in Tony Blair personally, he had to resign. He led us to this war. It was Lord Butler who was set up to look at the whole question of the intelligence, who accused the Prime Minister and the House of Lords a year ago of being disingenuous. Well, that's as close as you ever get in conventions of the House of Lords or the House of Commons to calling somebody a liar. The fact is we were not told the truth about many aspects of that operation, either the American citizens or the British citizens. But on the basis which we were told, many of us trusted the governments, whether they were American or British governments. I'm afraid a lot of that trust was bestowed, as we now realize, unjustifiably. But I'm not going to justify what went on. It has been a frightful fiasco, and many people, as you say, innocent people, that is the tragedy, have lost their lives in this.
Lord
But
Owen,
there we are,
we
we're
will
in
take
the
a short
present
break now.
situation.
When we come back, I'm going to ask you whether we can look at Iraq in isolation or with the context of the Middle East. Stay with us.
We're in fact on plan. And where we stand today is not, in my view, only acceptable, but truly remarkable. Former US CENTCOM commander Tommy Franks.